Hello and welcome. Today we are joined by Rachael Heffer from the Evangelical Alliance to talk about their recent research report, Finding Jesus, Identifying Pathways to Faith in Adulthood, which offers fascinating insights into the experiences and spiritual lives of people finding faith here in the UK. At Faith in Later Life, we're particularly interested in what this research may reveal about people finding Jesus in later life. And so I'll be digging into that a little bit. Whether you are involved in seniors ministry or you lead a church which includes older people, I hope you'll find this conversation both encouraging and thought-provoking. Rachael, thank you so much for coming along to share more about finding Jesus. But before we dive into the report, could you tell us a bit more about your role at the Evangelical Alliance and also how this Finding Jesus report came about?
Absolutely, yes. Well, hi, really nice to be with you again. And it is my joy because I've joined you before, I think it was sometime last year, talking about another piece of research which was called Talking Jesus, which again mapped sort of the shift in people's openness to things of faith. But yes, my pleasure to be with you today. My role, I've served at the Evangelical Alliance as head of mission. I've been there for about 7 years, and for many listeners, they may know the EA for being a unity organisation, and we've been around quite a long while. Next year we celebrate being 180 years old, so we were formulated in 1846, and really what the EA does is it seeks to, through our member organisations like Faith in Later Life, through our church membership, through our individual members, we really seek to serve the church, to cheer on, to champion, to resource, train, equip, lean in and pray for the local church, but also to speak on behalf of the evangelical church into the corridors of power as well. So the fascinating mix of both local church work, my role, I'm passionate about, again, being able to speak and meet with church leaders week in, week out, but to cheer on what mission, evangelism, it needs to look like. And in part of our wider work, again, we try and serve the church. So that's a little bit about the EA, I hope. You touched on this new piece of research. Well, it's relatively hot off the press. Finding Jesus research was launched in early June this year. And where it came from was that against the backdrop of so much other research this year, the Quiet Revival, Fusion's brilliant research amongst students, and again, even what the national press has said about the local church, we wanted to dig a bit deeper and find out what are those pathways that people are coming to faith. So in essence, we wanted to know what's happening, why is the journey starting, what is prompting people to explore faith, who's helping along the way, what does that look like, what happens at the point of actually making a decision, and what's happened since. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a flavour as to what it's about and where it came from.
Exciting stuff. We're really looking forward to digging deeper into what you discovered in this report, especially what that might mean for us sharing faith with those who are in later life. Rachael, what surprised you most about the data and about how adults come to faith?
Great question. There were a few things I think that jumped out at me. So we surveyed just under 300 individuals, and therein actually lies the first bit of good news, really. We went after 100 adults who've come to faith in the last 5 years. And when we started asking leaders like yourselves of mission organisations, of church leaders, we actually found that so many people were able to say, yes, people in my church, my have come to faith in the last 5 years, that our number, which was going to be 100, became just under 300, like I said, which is a great news headline, isn't it, to start with, really. People of all ages are coming to faith, and that was what we saw in this report. I think 3 things that jump out at me. One is, that surprised me, is just how quickly people told us that their journey of faith was. So I don't know about you, Alex, but for many of us who've been Christians maybe for a long time, we almost think that where we're praying for our friends or our family members, it may take 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years even to see people go on that journey towards Jesus. Or what the Finding Jesus report told us was that actually of those people, again, of all ages, you can look into the report or findingjesus.co.uk, we'll take anyone who wants to see a bit deeper. But we found that 59% of those just under 300 adults that we surveyed said that their journey from exploring faith to making that pivotal decision to follow Jesus, 59% said it was within under a year. Isn't that encouraging?
Absolutely.
And 34% told us that it was within 6 months. So that was one of the things that surprised me, is just how quick that journey was, and how encouraging that is to us as Christians. Say, do you know what? It may not be a lifetime. However old people are, that journey may actually be quite quick. I think
it's very, if I could just add, that's very exciting for us at Faith in Later Life, because one of the challenges that we have to manage is that with some older people, we just don't have very long to help them explore faith. We don't know how much longer they can show up to things, or how much longer we can show up with them. So to know that actually it doesn't take a decade to find Jesus is really encouraging for us.
Yeah.
Carry on, sorry, that was only your first one, sorry.
No, great. And I absolutely agree. I think we should be really encouraged that whatever age and stage people are at, whether it's our young people, adults, or as you said, in later life, God is doing something. He's stirring the mixing pot. He is powerfully at work, and we're seeing people come to faith really. The second stat, which I loved, was that when we asked people what prompted the journey for you to going even deeper into exploring faith, or exploring faith for the first time, 28% of people told us that what started and kick-started that journey or fueled it was a spiritual experience. And again, I think there's just something, we heard story after story of people, you know, whether they were in the street, they were in a garden shed. You can read some of the stories in the report. No matter where people were, it was fascinating to learn that actually what God was using amongst many people was this spiritual encounter. And again, we found, you know, people of all ages, even for some people who had been in the church for years, for decades, but had never actually had a real encounter with Jesus. How encouraging for us to be well that actually God would turn up the heat, that something of a, you know, a Christian life lived out even in church, but without that deeper experience of Jesus. We heard it time and time again that people said just something came over them. They were at a point of need, or a point of searching, or a point of desperation even, and yet God in all of his encountered people where they were at. So that was the second thing. The third thing I'd say, just briefly, I think that stood out for me, surprise or not, but encouragement, was that when we asked those just under 300 people what their previously held belief was, we found that 72% of the people that we surveyed could trace back to some kind of form of Christian input in their past. And so for many, again, of people in later life, they will have had, won't they, Christian teaching at school, maybe have gone to a church school, been part of a youth group or a choir or whatever it's been, or been in church in the past, and maybe pushed away against God and against faith. But how encouraging for us. 72% of people said when they've come to faith in adulthood, so definitely in later life, to whatever degree, that they said they could track back that actually residual Christianity had some root, and it just took something of the stirring of the Lord to bring that to the surface and bring them to the point of making a decision. So those would be the few things I would pull out as surprises.
Yeah. Amazing. I think that your third point there also is a real encouragement to us who may be sowing seeds of the gospel among younger people, among people, you know, our friends, our family, our neighbours, and we're not seeing any of those like results, if you like, at the moment, but we just have to trust God that, you know, we've prayed it, we've asked for it, we've sown it, and we may never see that promise being fulfilled in our lifetime or in our, you know, chances of seeing it, and yet God is still doing that. Those seeds are being watered, and they're growing into something wonderful later on, perhaps.
Yes, absolutely.
Exciting stuff. Do you think that the patterns that you've noticed might look different for someone exploring faith in later life, perhaps in their 60s, 70s, and beyond?
Well, it's a good question, isn't it? I don't know the answer to that exactly, whether it looks different. But what I think similarities might be, maybe across generations, but particularly older, is that actually none of us get to the point of searching, do we? We're always asking ourselves, what is it really all about? Talking Jesus told us, didn't it, that the biggest question that came out was, will everything be okay? But particularly amongst people in an older age category was, not just about what do I do with my life, what makes me happy. That was more for the younger age, but it's kind of what is life all about and what happens when I die. That came out equivalent of all age demographics. I think what we learned in Finding Jesus research is that, again, this sense of story after story told us that people said, do you know what, it kind of looked like I had it all. I had the career, I had the grandchildren, maybe I had the life that looked rosy. But we heard a number of different participants tell us, but really, if you scratch below the surface, I was just a bit miserable, or I was searching for deeper meaning. And that came out many times, that what started people's searching, going deeper, even against the backdrop of maybe a held faith that they may have had in the past, or, as we've just said, something of a residual knowledge of God. But what we found many people told us was it was that sense of searching, wanting more out of life, wanting to be a deeper encounter of some kind, that led people. And I don't know, Alex, you'll know much better than me, but I would guess that actually for all of us at any age, even as we're older as well, that search for depth of meaning, satisfaction, fulfillment in our later years as well is just as prevalent, isn't it? And we saw many people, again, through the research of all ages, again, including older, saying that that's what started their journey and led them deeper.
Yeah, definitely. It's one of the things that we would say about later life as an opportunity for the gospel is that with later life often comes a season of being more reflective, of asking the big question, of maybe considering their regrets and considering the legacy that they want to leave going forward. So yeah, a real opportunity and an encouragement that people are finding Jesus, they want to find him, and of course they can, and we can help them. The report mentions people being drawn to faith through relationships. What kind of relationships did the report discover were most influential?
Well, again, as we drew people, those 300, into a survey, but also with about 20 individuals, we went into a deeper dialogue with them to say, tell me more about that story, life, what happened. What we found was that not only do people not yet Christians observe Christians that they know, but equally they have this sort of curiosity. So the power of relationship and proximity and community came out really strongly. For example, when we asked that question again, what prompted the journey for you exploring faith? We found 29% of people said what prompted the journey for them was being able to see and witness the impact that Christian faith had on the lives of Christians they knew around them. So a sense of watching, observing, and being curious about how life and faith stacked up and went hand in hand. We also found that a further 29% said that it was through a Christian speaking to them about their faith, which is a reminder, isn't it, that our words actually carry impact. But interesting, dug a bit deeper in answer to your question as to the who, what came out was that the top answer, when we asked if or when they'd reached that point of decision, they committed their life to Jesus, who was it that was alongside? The top answer was that 35% of people told us it was people in a church context or friends who were not the church leader. The people said it was being part of a small group. That was the next top answer. And actually, church leader was much further down. Now, that's not to undermine at all, is it, the role of church leader? But it was really interested us that, again, it's people like you or me, the people in a cafe they might go to, or part of a hobby, or part of a community, or in the church service. Actually, again, it absolutely points to the power of relationship. And that you and me, as normal friends, being alongside, doing life, sharing faith, we're the ones that can be the best possible bridge to people coming to faith, because we're the ones that they might look to and want to hear from.
That is an encouragement. I also was reading a story in the report, and what it was bringing out was that people were having experiences of Christians in church, and it was just so different to the way that they'd experienced people in other contexts, and they were just really blessed by that. And I think we mustn't forget, I think we sometimes underestimate how different we are actually, and that they were talking about people were giving them time and patience and were showing a real interest in remembering things. And I thought, yeah, that is something we're really good at as church, is really taking a genuine interest in people and loving them well. So
Yeah.
yeah.
There's a couple of stories in the report that I love. One is about a woman who says she went along to one of the church cafes, and she just went home and said to her husband, I don't know what it is about that place, but I just love being there. She told her husband that she stays even to the point of clearing up because she just wants to be in that space and linger as long as possible. And hilariously, she said at the end of the quote that's in the report that people can read, she said, there's something about when you go there and they say, you know, what have you got coming up this week? And you'll go back the next week and people ask you, oh, how did you get on with that thing? And the woman who was telling us said, she went home and said to her husband, you know, these people remember this stuff that you don't even remember, you know. So, I mean, hilarious and maybe quite typical, but I think absolutely, as you said, Alex, there's something countercultural that often when people come into our doors, not necessarily in a church building, but more often than not it may be, but when they have that sense of warmth, of welcome, of time, of hospitality, you're right, people said they wanted to see practical kindness. Patient discussion came out. People wanted to ask questions. You know, let's not think that people, even in later life, have got it all landed, sorted. What we heard time again was people actually were intrigued. There was this sense of curiosity, but what people wanted most of all, they told us exactly as you said, time, patient discussion, authenticity. They wanted to see again people not having it all together, not knowing all the answers even, but being able to just discuss, look to the Bible, tease out the reality, how the Bible connects with life in the raw as it is. And that was truly transformational for people.
Yeah, and it is good news that the leader doesn't have to be all things to all people. It's good news for the leader, and it's an encouragement for us that as you say, we don't have to have it all worked out. But who we are in the power of the Holy Spirit is very attractive to people who are searching. Let's have a look at some more of our questions. Oh, yes, this one. Many respondents came to faith through difficult or transitional life moments. Can you tell us a bit more about these stories? And I suppose I'm quite aware that as people go into later life, there are more and more transitional or challenging moments in life.
Yeah. I mean, going back to what we vaguely touched on just earlier, the top answer when we said, what was it that, you know, started the journey, was this searching. 37% of people said they needed help with life, 34% needed that deeper meaning, as we've said. So again, this transient sort of leaning in, but also what we saw was this change in circumstances. 24% of people said it could be a change of circumstance that led them into the journey. And as we know, for some people, that could be something good. It could be, you know, marrying off a child. It could be marriage yourself. It could be a changing context, moving house. These can be positive things, can't they? But as we heard the stories, for a lot of people, it was a loss or an achievement. It was a change in circumstance, which, as we know, as we all get older, we often face these, don't we? The heartache or heartbreak or loss of loved ones and so on. And what we saw again was just, why is it a surprise to us, really? We've been through a lot even over the last number of years, haven't we? Changes in circumstances, global pandemic, cost of living crisis, threat of war, ongoing threat of war, loss for many people. But actually, we see so often, don't we, in these places that are raw, that they may be pain or trauma, doesn't it give God an opportunity to just draw closer to people? We heard one story, for example, of a guy called Donny who told us that he just reached the end. He just was thinking, what is life all about? He was despairing and devastated. And he was one of the people who told us about this overwhelming spiritual experience. He was down in the garden shed. And he said he'd even plotted to just, you know, how he was going to end it all, completely devastated. And he told us, amazingly, of just how in that moment of not even pouring his heart out to God, because he didn't recognize God in that moment, until even in the garden shed, he had this overwhelming sense of something of God's presence with him. And in that moment, what we heard from him is he went into the house, he took a dusty Bible off the shelf and he started reading it. And his story actually goes on through the report as well. We hear about, even as he read from the beginning of the Bible to the end, that even by the time he got to Exodus, he said, I was a believer. By the time he got to the Testament, he was a changed man and just broken for what Jesus had done for him. So I think there's this rawness, isn't there, places of pain that we often see in people. I certainly see it amongst my peers as well and in older folk, but it gives God the opportunity, doesn't it, to draw in closer to people. And what we saw time and time again, like I said, was just people see the sense of peace of God's love. And that's what they reported to, of just knowing that overwhelming sense of God's love, even in the midst of difficult situations and scenarios.
Yeah, and the church, when it comes to a church context, the church is actually really good at welcoming people who are struggling, whether it's with bereavement, whether it's with addictions, whether it's with sadness or heartache of any other sort. And we're really well equipped to welcome people. And I think, that shows as people find a sense of belonging. I know of a lady who joined a knitting group, wasn't interested in faith at all. And then years later, after being part of this knitting group, her husband died. And suddenly, within that safe place of that knitting group, she began to ask questions about faith. And so, yeah, these transitional moments, we're good at catching people in those, and we need to be ready to respond, as the Lord leads in those times.
I think we almost need to have just a bit more confidence in that, don't we? For many of us who might have been in the church some long while, we probably take it for granted how warm people are, how welcoming, how genuine people are. And yet, as you said, people coming into the building find it utterly intriguing. Why are there people like this? We heard that phrase times. I was in a church just 2 weeks ago and met two women over lunch who met in the cafe that was run by the church. And they'd both been, one bereaved, actually one through a divorce. They were 20 years apart in age. But I met these two women over lunch who've become the best of friends as they were drawn into the church cafe environment. They met each other there, but they both said to me independently, they just were bowled over by the sense of welcome, hospitality, care, value. And it really helped them on their road to recovery. But out of that was born a beautiful friendship as well. What an opportunity we have to do that. And it doesn't have to be rocket science, does it? That's what we discovered.
No.
Simple, intentional, prayerful, but leaning into people's lives brings about transformation because of what God does, but through us as well in those places. So I wonder what it looks like to have a bit more confidence. What we do will really be transformative for some people.
Yeah, and we can come alongside people with our own experiences. I think it's important when we do have an opportunity, either in the church or in the neighborhood or in our family circles, and people are in a difficult place, for us actually to say, I've been there. And sometimes that story won't be, I've been there and now everything's amazing. It could be, I've been there and I'm journeying on. Here are one or two things that have helped me along the way. And I think that authenticity is very helpful to people. Good stuff. Why do you think people are still coming to faith in today's culture? I mean, haven't they got everything they could possibly need?
Well, that's a good why are people? Well, the good news is that we hear resoundingly that they are, don't they? Heard the recent Quiet Revival research from the Bible Society that tracks back to 2018, that there are now 2 million more people in the church than I mean, this should really encourage us as Christians, shouldn't it? But as to the why, again, we could talk about it all day, couldn't we? But my feeling is, and again, what we've heard and we've already picked up on a little bit is, I think actually, whether we're young, teenager, young adult, or in our older years, in later life, I think that the world just recognizes this sense of, we feel a bit disillusioned. I think we're bombarded, if we're on social media or on the internet, we're bombarded by stories and images and bad news often, aren't we? If we're a younger person, again, all these 6,000 to 8,000 images a day that might hit us on Snapchat or Instagram, but equally people of older age online and so on. What we see, what we hear, the stories we hear, I think it can drag us down somewhat, can't it, and be demoralizing. But what I would say is, I think in those places, I think what we're seeing is this almost this sense of the world at large just doesn't quite cut it. We've sought meaning, you know, a lot of people outside the church, in the universe, in crystals, in manifesting. I was speaking to somebody just the other week who was saying they were into all of those things, and yet in the midst of it just felt totally disillusioned. It just wasn't quite cutting it. So I wonder whether why people are becoming Christians is because they're searching for something more, looking for deeper meaning, wanting help in life, as we mentioned earlier. And what we're seeing is in those places, whether it's through visions and dreams, we're hearing that increasingly, Jesus appearing to people in visions and dreams, whether it's experiences like Donnie that we mentioned, whether it's sitting around a cafe table, knitting, playing chess, being out on a walk, you know, whatever that might be. Encounters with Christians, I think, are provoking questions for people, aren't there? And the good thing is that even the mainstream media now is reporting that people are coming to faith, that the church is alive in a whole new way. So I wonder whether we've lived through maybe years, decades even, of shrinking back because we've been told that people don't want to know, that Christianity is old-fashioned and outdated. And yet what we're seeing is this upsurge of people are saying, I need something to hook my life around. They're going to the Bible in ways that we haven't seen for decades. We're hearing leaders talking about people coming in off the streets because they've watched a church service online, or they've read the Bible and they want to know more. So isn't it encouraging? I just think that God's powerfully at work stirring something. And as the church, we need to be ready to respond through not just church services, but through some of the ministries and things that we do during the week too, to meet people at those points of need.
Definitely. And I wonder if the rate at which people can try stuff is so quick now that people have worked their way through all the self-help books and all the different other ways of transforming themselves, and perhaps they're reaching the end of that a bit quicker, and therefore then there's perhaps a more of a spiritual openness because people want to be changed. They don't want to just have different groups to belong to, or different identities to clone. We want to be different, don't we? You know, people get fed up with the way it's always been, and now it's time for change, and they're seeing Jesus as having that transforming power. But people reach the end of themselves.
And it's really been really interesting to us to analyse one of the particular differences between the Talking Jesus research and the Finding Jesus research. Because one thing that Talking Jesus told us, that hypothetically, when we said to people, where would you go to explore faith? What came out as the top answer was the digital online presence. But what we see when we ask people who have gone on that journey, who have become Christians, is that actually, whilst they might start in the looking online, people of all ages, again, watching the church online, looking at people's social media, whatever that looks like, what we see again for people of all ages is when that journey becomes, like you said, they've got a bit beyond everything else. What people do, it showed us time and time again, is people seek out people. They seek out community, don't they? They seek out relationships, because it's in those places with, again, that time to just be, to exist, to be welcomed, to get to know people, to have that sense of community. That's what really cuts it for people, doesn't it? It's not against the backdrop of an epidemic of loneliness and mental health issues and so on. Actually, we saw time and time people come to the local church. They want to be part of something. And as with Faith and Later Life and Church Champions, as with the local church, aren't we so well placed to be able to draw alongside people? Again, as we said, just create those portals of community for them.
Definitely. People are craving a sense of belonging, and they want to be loved. Interestingly, looking for love, not in the dating sense, but wasn't that one of the key things that came out of your research, that people wanted to experience being loved?
Yeah. Yes, again, lots of stories just spoke about that, the power of just feeling that warmth, acceptance of others. And interestingly, a different one of the questions, Alex, that we asked in the research was, what element of the gospel most drew you to
That's
Jesus?
it. That's what I was thinking about. Sorry. Yes, go. You explain more.
Well, it was fascinating to learn that 48% of people said it was the recognition, quite simply, of Jesus' love for me that brought them to that point of making a decision.
Yes.
It's followed by 46% of people who said that it was what the gospel spoke of in terms of hope and purpose for life, but not just life on earth here, but life beyond. So 40% of people told us that. Interestingly, people said that what challenged them the most in terms of the gospel was believing that they could be forgiven. And I wonder, particularly for those of us who've lived a bit and into our later years, there's been a lot under the bridge, hasn't there? And so it was helpful for us to recognize whether we're ministry leaders, small group leaders, church group leaders, church leaders. You know, for some people, actually, it's messy what people come to our groups with or come to church when they've made a decision, or whether they're on that journey. Actually, some of those messy transitions might challenge us as to what that welcome, love, hospitality and discipleship looks like. But we were also really interested in that question of what drew people to the gospel. 34% of people said that what drew them was that they recognized the gospel was true, profound and beautiful. The previous question, why are people coming to faith still today? I wonder if it is, again, people are looking for truth. In a world that paints every shade of grey, maybe it doesn't quite cut it. And that's where the Bible put in people's hands, put out in our cafe tables or whatever, but people are reaching for it. The Bible has so much to say, doesn't it? So whether it's love, hope, purpose, truth, there's lots of reasons why people are drawn. But as you said, the top answer there by quite some way was that people need to know and feel loved.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the other challenges I noticed in the research was people being concerned about how it would affect the existing relationships they have. And I was thinking that that probably is a really true challenge for people in later life, because you've kind of, you're perhaps a bit more established with your friendship circle, with your neighborhood circle, and then to suddenly show up and be transformed by the Holy Spirit and have some different behaviors and attitudes and language. It must be quite a challenge for younger ones, but especially for older ones too. I wondered, what else did you find out about that subject?
I think exactly as you said, we asked the question, what did you find most challenging? So like I said, we wanted to know what happened at the point of making and interesting, just to note on that very briefly, 42% of people said that they made that decision to follow Jesus completely on their own. Only 5% said it was at a Christian event. Now that doesn't then knock the place of Christian event, church services, giving people the chance to respond is really important, isn't it? But it shows actually we need to, I think, as leaders, as people in different contexts, we need to affirm and recognise that people may hear, sense, see, witness other Christians be in church, hear something, but actually that moment for so many was deeply private. Back of that, the question that we said, what did you find most challenging? For a high percentage of people, it came out that it was the questions that they had from family, friends, relative, and the negative responses that they sometimes had. And I think exactly as you've said, again, the more friendship groups we have at whatever age and stage, but particularly we may have in later life, some of those solid lifelong friendships, albeit a few of them, but people you've known for a long time, when coming to faith challenges language or behaviours or lifestyle choices. We again heard from many of the participants who were very honest and said, it was really hard. There was change. I needed to bring other things in line with what the gospel and the character of Jesus was calling me to. But actually, it was really tough to change and leave some of those things behind. I think overridingly, it felt like in doing this research, once again, it was helpful recognition of how for the church, for church leaders, for ministry leaders, how messy it can be, how challenging it can be for people, particularly actually those who were coming to faith from other faith backdrops. You know, imagine whole communities, maybe their faith and their faith didn't quite fit the same way. So the challenge, I think, remained with us and maybe helpful for faith in later life was, what does it look like to judge people? What does it look like to side? Recognizing that people come into our context, it's not one size fits all in terms of relationship and discipleship, but learning about that wider context, walking with people in some of those tricky transitions. Heard, for example, about one guy who came to faith. Again, he was in late midlife, I would say, living with his partner, came to faith in Jesus, and again over a 2-year period actually said to his partner about his new faith. She then journeyed towards Jesus as well, but there are aspects of them living together, other lifestyle that had to change as he wanted it to, but you can anticipate, can't you, just challenging, sacrificial, but ultimately, you know, he was obviously found the joy, the hope, the purpose of the Lord in that, but it didn't come without its costs as well. So hopefully helpful from this research for us to recognise some of that too.
Yeah, I think it's a really key aspect of the research for us as the Christians, perhaps in those people's lives, to exercise real patience and understanding. I think sometimes when we see a new believer, we can perhaps get a bit frustrated that they're not yet doing this or they're not yet changing that. But actually, if we knew all of how this is impacting their new life, I think it helps us to exercise that love and patience and care for them, and to journey with them and share our own stories of once upon a time, if it was the case, you know, we were there too. And so, yeah, to be ready for that, rather than just be concerned. I remember once, straight after a baptism of somebody, I was standing outside the church building and a lady came up to me and she said, "That was a lovely baptism. Well, let's hope he can give up smoking next." And I just thought, yeah, I understood where she was coming from, but like, can we just celebrate this moment? Can we just stay in this? He's got so many changes coming. You know, if smoking is something the Lord calls him to give up, you know, that can be all in its own time. But yeah, we have some quick fire reactions sometimes, and I think this research is really helpful in helping us to level some of that. So yeah, thank you for that.
Well, I think that's where, for me, it points back to not only the power of relationship, doesn't it? Of actually we accept people as they are, knowing just as Jesus that we journey with, and we need to have that patience and so on, and not pretend that we have it all lined up. We don't. Looking at Jesus' example, I mean, how well did Jesus do that point of encounter? You know, the and so on. He just accepted, didn't he? But he brought about challenge at the right time in the right way. But there was a sense of that holistic welcome and so on. I think the challenge I'd throw into the mix was interesting. Speaking to a church leader colleague of mine actually about a year ago, and he said to me, yeah, we're seeing people of all ages come into the church. They've maybe never engaged before, or they did way back when, but they're coming back wanting to find out more. They receive a warm welcome from our church, the welcome, the hospitality and so on. But he went on to say, after 3 months, we lose so many of them. My colleague Ben, I said, well, that's fascinating and devastating, but why then? Why? And he said, because they're getting a warm welcome and we might plug them into a small group or something, but individually they're not developing the depth of relationships and friendships that will keep them there. And I thought, oh, therein lies a challenge, doesn't it, for us as individuals, in the different groups or services that we're a part of. How much do we go beyond our own busyness and, you know, with other things in mind on a Sunday or a midweek, how much do we rush off? Whereas actually it's that time and that consolidation, leaning in to develop friendships. Because what we want, of course, with all of these wonderful new Christians, don't we want them to find their feet, find their path in the church family, but also develop the depths of those transformational friendships too. Keeps them in those contexts with the ability to then learn more, go to the Bible, learn from other Christians, but also for us to learn from them too. Let's not pretend we've got all the answers. But I thought it was interesting, the challenge of not just the welcome and the nurture and hospitality, but that longevity of deepening of friendships that people crave as well.
Yeah, that is interesting, because one of the things I sometimes say when I'm asked about evangelism among older people is I say something like, you've got to be in it for the long haul. Nobody wants to be your project. And I'm just listening to you thinking, actually, that same goes for discipleship. Discipleship, you've got to be in it for the long haul, because, you know, the same thing goes. And it can take years for somebody to change 30, 40, 50, 60 years worth of behavior and understanding about the world. And 3 months really isn't going to cut it, is it? So no, really interesting. Well, is there anything else from the report or from your own reflections that you think could help us shape ministry for older people? As we've been talking, is there anything that's occurred to you that you think, I want to share this with the church champions at Faith in Later Life?
Oh, well, first of all, I think keep going. It's so worthwhile, isn't it? When we hear these stories of people who've had something that's prompted the journey, you know, they've gone to the Bible, they're seeking out people, you know, they're wanting conversations. I just think all that church champions are plugging into, resourcing the church in, encouraging the church in. You know, praise God, this is an exciting time for the church because God is so scattering the seed because of us and despite of us. I think what jumps out for me from the research is just, again, that challenge around discipleship. I think more than anything is that people's starting point may be so far back that actually what I have come across a number of times is churches, even leadership teams as well, saying we're reviewing what our discipleship looks like because people are coming in, they've come to faith quickly, as we said, they've made decisions. But they've told us, that, again, through the report, that some of the biggest challenges are learning to read the Bible, learning to pray, but also navigating some of these difficult contexts and negative responses and so on. So I think my encouragement would just be, church champions are so needed, aren't they, for people in their later years. The power of relationship is critical. People are being drawn to Jesus. They are being drawn to the church. They're telling us that actually the biggest thing that helped them, the top answer was 59% of people said what helped them the most on their faith journey was attending a local church. And that's where you find church champions, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So just let's keep praying, be intentional, be encouraged, rally the whole church as to why it is absolutely paramount to not write off older people who may have made their faith decisions. I thought it was very wise of a church leader who said to me a number of months ago, who said, Rachel, what you're telling us through some of this research is that where we've maybe prayed for or invited people of an older age to come to church, a church quiz, an activity, whatever it is, where they may have said no in the past, actually their answer now might be quite different because the landscape shifted. People are more open. So I think that would be my lasting encouragement, would just be, God is at work, we're in the midst of it, but let's not think that people are closed off, that it's a done deal. There is a shift, an openness, a curiosity that we're seeing. And don't we all believe that by the power of the Holy Spirit, the people that God puts around you, that God puts around me, we're there amongst them for a purpose, with a purpose. And we believe and trust, don't we, through the church champions and well beyond, that we'll see many people drawn to know Jesus in our day, in these next few weeks, months, looks like. And the answer, where it may have been no in the past, it just might not be a no now. So we just need to go there and be a bit bolder, braver, prayerful, intentional, and who knows what God will do in us and through us.
Yeah, reissue those invitations, go back again. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Rachel. Where can people go to find the full report and read it all for themselves?
Well, it's all free to download on findingjesus.co.uk. However, if you would prefer a printed A5 copy, all of the graphs and the findings are all there. Much easier to dissect sometimes with a paper copy. But if you'd prefer that, then you can just simply contact us at the Evangelical Alliance, or get a hold of my email address, which is r.heffer@eauk.org. We'd very happily send you a copy or a few copies out in the post. So findingjesus.co.uk is probably the best place. And I'd just encourage you, it's not just the statistics, but the stories of those lives changed is hugely encouraging. So do take a look and check it out.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much for unpacking some of the key findings from the Evangelical Alliance's Finding Jesus report for us today. It's an encouraging reminder that people of all ages are continuing to find Jesus, and that we should have great courage to go again or go for the first time and share our faith with our friends, our neighbours, and of course through the ministry we exercise in our churches. Thank you for watching. We hope these findings inspire you as you continue to help older people have faith in later life. Rachel, thanks again. I can't wait for the next interview. I wonder what the next report might be.
Thanks so much for having me. God bless.
Take care.